So we've come to peg 16 today at Evesham. For those of you who know it, it's a relatively deep peg. It is one of my favourite pegs for barbel fishing, in all honesty, because it's a nice steady peg with a reasonable depth throughout the peg. And obviously for fishing for barbel on the pole, you're going to need a reasonable amount of depth to get that kind of control on the fish. If you're in shallow water, obviously you know yourselves, if you pull one way, the barbel is going to try and go the other way. So by being in deeper pegs, you can get the pole high up above them, which hopefully I'll get a chance to show you later. And by doing so, the fish tend to swim around in circles, or if not, they don't get much speed up. So, onto the rig. Today, I'm going to be using a 15 hybrid elastic. Now, the reason for that is, obviously, you're going to need enough stretch you can get the pole above the fish, so you need something not too heavy. But obviously, a 15 is still plenty of backbone, plenty of strength that you're going to land anything really you're going to hook on the river. That goes down to an 018 main line. Same thing again, balance to the elastic, which is obviously important, but it's still plenty of strength, plenty of robustness that whether the fish tries to take you through a snag or if it's just a very, very big fish, I have had fish up to 13, 14 pound on the pole and got them out, that it's still going to cope with them. We go down then to a 6 gram inline float. Now there is a bit more flow on here than I would normally like. We've had a bit of rain the last few days. So 6 gram is, I won't say necessary, but it's preferable to keep that bait presented perfectly still on the bottom, which is important for today. Inline, just so you don't wreck your float. Obviously, if you're going with big strong lines, you don't want to be really going around the side of the body because you will just cut into the float and then you're going to damage your line, you're going to damage the float, and it's just not nice. Underneath that, I've got a few number 8 shot, just so I can, obviously you've got your depth marker and I can adjust how much bristle I do or don't want sticking out. That goes down to a solid bulk of Olivet and shot, just above my hook length. And the idea for that is that that's going to be just sitting, just fractionally off the bottom. Obviously that will give me all the actual shotting of my float. And you only need it in one big clump because we're fishing for big fish, it's not got to be overly delicate. Onto the hook length. I've got 1.5 foot to 2 foot of 016. Once again, nice and strong, but balanced perfectly to the elastic and the main line. It's going to cope with anything you're going to hook, essentially, on the river. But in a match situation, you often here at Evesham need more than just the one barbel. You'll often need a barbel plus a backup weight of other smaller fish. So by fishing 016, it's still light enough that you're going to pick up the perch, the eels, the big roach, or even tench and stuff like that. Then I've got 3 clumps of number 8 shot. That's just to keep everything firm on the bottom. You're going to want the bait presented as still as you can for the big fish today. You don't want it wafting up off the bottom, moving around, because it tangles your hook lengths, you get twists in your line, it's just not ideal. Then I've got a size 12 Super Spade, a nice big strong hook that's not going to open up on you. You can fit 2 worms on it, 1 worm on it, a bunch of maggots if you really, really want to. And like I say, it's not going to open up. It's a very, very sharp hook that's going to get a good hook hold on it for you. And it's ideal for when big fish are pulling back. My second rig is pretty much identical down to the terminal end. Same size float, same size Olivet, all exactly the same. And on this one, I've once again got 016, slightly longer this time on this hook length. Still with 3 clumps of 3 lots of number 8s at each clump. But I've got a size 12 eyed hook this time, a nice big strong one, and a pellet band just for fishing a pellet over the top. We all know barbel like a pellet, and if all else fails, I think I'm going to nab one on that. Okay, so on to bait. Obviously, you're not really limited to any bait to use on the river for barbel. They're going to eat anything. But there's a few favourites that I like to use, which I've just had success on, so I've got the confidence in them. The first one, and I think the most important one in terms of my bait armoury, is chopworm. Chopworm, it's a smelly bait. It's a bait that if you really mince it up, doesn't put a lot of food content in the water, but it will smell, it will waft down your peg, and it will bring in all kinds of fish, including the barbel. Obviously, I like to fish a very worm-dominated mix through my bait dropper, just because, like I say, there's not a massive food content going in, but the smell, nothing really compares to it in my opinion for chopworm. It's just perfect. The second one is hemp. Barbel love hemp. It's a heavy bait that will sit on the bottom, it won't move too much in the flow, so it keeps a nice baited area for you to fish over. It's relatively smelly in terms of they find it, but I like it because it's very selective. There's not going to be lots of fish coming up, picking it up like you would have a maggot or a castor, and it'll hold the bottom, so you know you've always got bait there on the deck. The next bait, and similar to the hemp for me, is halibut pellets. They're very, very smelly. They're heavy, so they'll hold the bottom, and you know you've got the bait there still on the bottom, and they're extremely selective. Other than barbel, maybe a carp if we're very lucky, there's very little else that's going to come up on this stretch of the river and be eating 6-10 mil pellets. You know you're going to have a very high smell content bed of bait where you're fishing. Next is a bait. I don't think I've ever fished a match on the Avon and not brought with me, or any river for that matter. Casters. Casters are a bait that all fish will like. It will bring little fish into your peg, which will in turn chomp them up, bring the smell down your peg to draw in the bigger fish. And equally, big fish will come and pick them up off the bottom and will chomp away quite happily on them themselves. It's important to get a fresh caster for barbel. You do get it on slightly older casters, you will have okay results, but in my opinion, fresh caster all the way, you can't beat them. And then finally, maggots. I will feed a few maggots today, but I tend to err away from them a little bit when fishing for big fish. They're a light bait, so they will move down your peg a lot. They tend to bury in silt a lot if you're on a silty bottom, and they bring in a lot of little fish, which, especially little eels today on the method we're doing, we're trying to avoid. We don't want them in our pegs. You'll get a lot of missed bites off them. They'll eat up a lot of bait that's on the bottom, and they just become a bit of a nuisance without adding much weight to your net. So I try and stay away from maggots, but I've got some here that if we're struggling a little bit or the peg quietens off a little bit, we can introduce them, and the bit of movement on the bottom will hopefully drag some fish in. Down to the hook bait. I've brought with me, once again, my trusty worms, Dendrobina worms. Not everyone's preference for catching barbel, but I've had a lot of good results and a lot of big fish on them, so I've got the confidence on it. And in a match situation, it's versatile enough that you can fish a worm knowing you can pick up almost any other fish of a reasonable size in the river. And so therefore, in a match situation, you can't beat them in my opinion. Obviously, barbel fishing, I've brought pellets with me. 10 mil or bigger normally for me for barbel fishing. A big smelly pellet preferably. Slightly different if you can from your feed pellets, so they can pick it out. It's something a bit different. And obviously 10 mil, you're not going to get pestered by little fish. You know your bait can be on the bottom, you haven't got to move it, it's there. If a barbel or a big fish comes along, he's going to mop it up. Right, I think it's time we get some bait in the dropper and see what we can catch. Okay, so today I'm going to be mainly feeding using a bait dropper. As you can see, this is a bait dropper. Essentially, you fill it up with whatever particles bait you want in here. Close the lid. You'll ship it out to wherever you want to get to where you're fishing. Lower it down as it hits the deck. That opens the door, and your particles will fall out, leaving you a nice smallish area of bait on the deck. Much preferable to loose feeding or even ground baiting, because obviously all we're really wanting today in our case is loose particles, so we know exactly where they're landing. Inside the bait dropper today, I've got a mixture of chopped worm, caster, a few maggots, and a lot of pellet and hemp. And I'm just spreading it evenly, each mix about the same throughout the dropper, just to make sure I've got a nice even spread of all the particles on the bottom. What I will do today, as we're targeting a big fish, I'll give it a few droppers with this bigger dropper right where I'm fishing. Get a nice central area, smell, food content for the fish. And then with my slightly smaller dropper, I'll just put a few slightly further over, slightly closer in, just there's a little bit of an area to get a bit of an interest with an epicenter in the middle. Right, it's going to drop us some bait in now. Obviously you'll notice on my pole I have got a couple of cable ties. These are important. You don't want to be dragging out, I've seen it before in the past where people have got lots of line on deep pegs and they're trying to hold the bait dropper and let it ping out on the elastic or try and hover it off the water. In my opinion, if you can get a couple of cable ties or even a pole hookup, it's so much easier and so much safer. I tend to use 2 little cable ties rather than 1 big one, just so it doesn't damage the pole so much. And it's important that you keep all of your bulk, your olivet, anything that could damage your pole, hanging down below the cable ties. Obviously, you don't want to be shipping out and having a olivet or heavy shot knocking against your pole, because obviously you're going to dink your pole, and that's how you get breakages. So 2 cable ties, in my opinion, and keeping the olivet well below them is always preferable. Right, so swinging the bait out now in the bait dropper. It's important to let your bait dropper settle. Obviously, you don't want to be feeding miles too far out or too close, so it's important you can just let it settle just on the water where it needs to be, and gently lower it down, making sure it all goes down in line to where you want it, onto your far bank marker. And in my opinion, it's important to slightly pull it just upstream as you open it up, just so it doesn't drift down and open it further than you want it. Okay, oh, little fish there. So there have been quite a few little fish in the peg today, quite a few little perch, as you can see, and a lot of little eels. Now, an important thing to do when fishing for big fish and laying on is to make sure that there's always a good body of bait on the deck, which obviously when you've got lots of little fish in your peg, you can't always guarantee that it's still going to be there. So topping up is really important. As we're targeting big fish, I'm going to continue to use the big dropper, and I'm going to essentially top up throughout the day. You have to judge it a little bit as to how your day's going. So if you're having a really good day and there's lots of big fish there, you've got to adjust your bait accordingly. If there's lots of little fish in your peg and you think they're mopping up all your bait, you've either got to starve them off so they'll go, or feed them off. Today I chose to feed them off, so I've essentially kept putting on bait droppers in to keep the bait there, so I know there's a good area of bait on the bottom, and that in theory it should feed the little fish like your perch and your roach off. As to how frequently you should do it, once again, it's got to be a judge it on the day preference. I like to, when I do it, give it 2 droppers in one go. Couple of reasons. First reason is you get a nice amount of bait in on the bottom straight away. You haven't got to do it quite so regular that way, and your dropper's not going in and spooking any fish you've got there. But also it means if you are a little bit off with one of your droppers, so you're a little bit further out or a little bit shorter than you particularly want to be, you've then got another one going in to make sure you've still got a consistent area. So as you can see, the rain has moved in now. It's getting a bit horrible, getting a bit cold. It's been an interesting session. I've had lots of eels caught, a couple of big eels, a chub about £2, some perch, a big roach. Unfortunately, the barbel haven't fed today. It's not ideal conditions for them. There is water on and it is pacey, but it's still very clear. There's not much colour in, and so we were a little bit up against it. It's been enjoyable. There's still been plenty of fish having a munch, and obviously we know had the conditions been better, had they been feeding, we would have caught fish today. Obviously I've fished in the same method I did win the Evesham Team Champs last year, fishing the exact same method, had 2 barbel out on it, and throughout the whole stretch it's a method that when it's right it works really well, but the river's got to be perfect for it. You've got to have coloured water, you've got to have obviously barbel feeding in your peg, and you've got to have a little bit of luck, as with all fishing. But very enjoyable session, very, very informative I'll say, but very, very damp as well.